Welcome to the fifth and final podcast in our series of 5 podcasts for National Work-Life Week 2013. Join me, Liz Morris, as I explore in these 5 podcasts, with the input of 5 leading experts, the possibility of having it all. A full life with a good sense of life balance, high performance at work and well-being. With the full-on demands of modern life, is it really possible to achieve? Or do we need to sacrifice at least one aspect to be able to achieve another? Joining me throughout this series of podcasts in the studio are Avril Lyman, internationally renowned executive coach and author, Professor Carrie Cooper, CBE, Pro Vice-Chancellor for External Relations and Distinguished Professor of Organisational Psychology and Health at Lancaster University Management School, Chair of the Academy of Social Sciences, President of Relate, and immediate past President of the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy. Ben Warnsborough-Jones, a Special Forces soldier in the British Army, now combining this work as a reservist with supporting civilian leaders to build highly effective teams. And via audio conference, joining us is Suzanne Jacobs, lead researcher on our most recently published paper exploring human intrinsic motivation and the impact of trust on performance and well-being, and also John Dent, physical trainer and nutritionist to elite sportsmen and women as well as senior executives. In our first podcast, we explored the relationship between performance, balance and well-being, and what it is that really motivates us. We learned from our panel of experts how to identify what's really important, our core needs and our values, and how, when these are not being met, our performance suffers, as well as our well-being and our ability to have a full and balanced life. In our second podcast, we asked the question, whose balance is it anyway? And explored with Ben, Avril and Carrie the possibility of choosing and directing your internal dialogue and your actions, with examples from working in the city and also when being deployed to a war zone. In our third podcast, John helped us understand how we could work with our bodies to build good physical and mental well-being, and by doing so, drive high performance at work and build the capability to have a full and balanced life. In the fourth podcast, Avril, Carrie and Suzanne and Ben explored how important relationships are to our resilience and sense of well-being. We also had a guest panellist, Dr. Simon Burnett, who led an 18-month research programme with working families and the relationship charity 1+1. Simon shared the findings and the output of the research, which included 5 actions to help build positive relationships at work. In this, our 5th and final podcast in the series, we'll explore the subject of strengths and talents. Why is it important for us to work with our strengths? How do we identify what our strengths are? And how do we use them, even when, at first look, the work we do may not necessarily obviously play to our strengths? The concept of working with our strengths often doesn't sit very well with our business or wider culture. Our personal development plans are often full of those opportunities for growth. In other words, our weaknesses. Because, after all, as Suzanne shared with us in our very first podcast, our brains are pattern matching systems. Anything that doesn't fit with our concept of how things should be is interpreted as a threat to survival, and a weakness is perceived as just that. We're very good at pointing out what's not right. And when it comes to recognising the strengths in others, well, it's much easier to be critical of their weaknesses. And when somebody does praise or point out another person's strength, it's just so very easy to take this as a veiled criticism of perhaps our own weaknesses, pushing us down in status and threatening our need to be recognised and valued. So, with all this negative baggage, Avril, why is it important to look at things in a different way and recognise and work with our strengths?
We talked earlier about the lack of engagement in organisations, and what we know from all the research in positive psychology is that people are likely to be most engaged when they're playing to their strengths. When we are using our strengths, we're likely to be engaged. And those stories that I ask people to tell me which point their strengths, people don't usually notice if they're happy, sad, cold, need coffee, if they're truly engaged, and they'll only be engaged when they're using their strengths.
When we talk about strengths and how to identify them, there are, of course, online inventories and surveys that you can do, such as the free questionnaire on the Authentic Happiness website run by the Pennsylvania University. But you also talk about working with clients in an interactive process, asking people to tell the story of when they feel enthused and passionate, when time almost stood still. And from this, you're able to work with the clients to identify what skills, knowledge and talents are being used, which together make up our strengths. But I'm wondering, once you've gone through this process and discovered your strengths, what happens when you realise that actually the job you're doing doesn't seem to enable you to use your strengths at all? Just how do you use your strengths when your role doesn't seem able to support you to do so?
I think we're sometimes a bit limited in our creativity and thinking there, but if I take a couple of practical examples, so it's how we get that into the tasks that are not obviously as enticing. My own personal example, having the capacity to love and be loved as a top strength, my own example was when I had an issue about VAT. And I had the intelligence to read a VAT manual, but it would take an awful lot of espresso to get me through it, and I would be naughty and I would distract myself. I called them up and said, I want to come and see you, which I believe not a lot of people do. And I got two of them, and at the start they were saying, no, you can't do that. It was about coding something. And by the end, they were going, you're right. You code it that way. Yes, result. It was fun. It was play, but it was using a strength in a novel way. I had a client, an investment banker, who was behaved atrociously, a delightful man, very bright, terrible behaviours, awful management and leadership. And once we established sufficient trust, I pointed out the fact that his top strength was love of learning. And so I pointed out the fact that I just didn't understand, with somebody who had such a love of learning, I couldn't really understand how he could bear to be so ignorant about people. And there was a sort of small shock moment, and he came back saying, but I thought I had to really like them. I thought I had to want to cuddle them, and please don't ever. Play to your strengths. Use that love of learning. And by the time I saw him the next time, he'd read several books on evolutionary psychology that had no relevance whatsoever. But he was fascinated by their behaviour. He was fascinated by knowing more about what made them tick and motivation, because he knew he could do it intellectually. And he'd been waiting to feel like this person who actually liked people, and it wasn't going to happen. So finding a new way to use your strength every day, rather than the ways that you've always done it, is an interesting exercise, and it means that more of the time you're more engaged with the task in hand. And also that consciousness of somebody else's strengths. I have colleagues here for whom curiosity is their highest topic. So you might say, can we have this or do that? And then what you get back is, did you know there's this and there's that and we could do it this way? And sometimes you just want an answer, but it's knowing not to squash that this person is engaged and excited because they're being able to indulge that curiosity And probably we'll get a better answer out of it long run, where sometimes we just feel we don't have time to indulge people. No, this is striking at the core of them in order to really cherish people and get the best out of them at work, knowing what their strengths are. Sometimes just by asking them, means that we can tailor the way that we tell the story, the way that we engage with them, the way that we try to motivate them. We can connect with their strengths. Because one of the biggest mistakes we make is we assume everybody's the same as us, whether it's their values or their motivation or their strengths of character. And it's a terribly bad place to start from in making relationships.
I'm wondering if perhaps there's a potential dark side to using our strengths. Not knowing if you're hungry, tired or hot or cold means that we can easily neglect our basic needs, and this, we know, will impact our ability to perform as well as shake our resilience and sense of balance.
Yes, I would like to think that everybody who's sort of working all of these hours is utterly, truly engaged, and I think the statistics would tell us otherwise. I think there are huge issues about how we handle our resilience. And again, it's back to, I'm sorry, I'm going back to this, bad habits set in. And again, those same bankers I was talking about in 2009 wouldn't let us get off the topic of resilience. And what came out was they weren't breaking, they weren't eating. And then they'd have a bar of chocolate. And hey, I love chocolate. But it wasn't enough to sustain them. And it wasn't enough to sustain their intellectual functioning. Certainly creative thinking. All of that gets wrecked if you're not looking after yourself properly. So I think there are some things that... And it sounds awfully grown up and a little bit boring to think about the hygiene factors. I've done stress audits of entire councils in the past and various things, and you get this impression of an entire county of insomniacs tossing and turning in the night. And at the risk of sounding like your mother, a good night's sleep, what is it, knits that ravelled care. And people are... very poor at just making sure they get a good night's sleep. And I think sometimes it's because it makes us feel very boring. I know there are times in the week where I'm going to be up at 6 o'clock and you think, well, that means I have to take myself off to bed at 10 if I want a good... How boring when there's a really good programme on at 11. And so we're wrestling with our, I think, quite childish nature there. That is not fair. I don't want to go to bed early. But we have to take stock and say, am I getting the rest and relaxation that means I can function well and efficiently the next day? Because when people, and I think there are many people who are suffering from a kind of chronic sleeplessness, are weary before they ever hit their desk. They don't have the energy to get through that commute in the morning. They're then eating some rubbish and missing a meal and having no exercise. You're doomed. And it is hard to change these habits, but it often starts with just making very small differences. And the chaps that we were working with, and then had this again since, lamented the fact they didn't seem to have time for their sports, the rugby, the cricket, the sailing at that point. So we looked at what was the least they could do that would give them some exercise. So they started walking from a further away tube station to the office. One of them still walks from Victoria Station to Bishopsgate every morning, admittedly at an incredibly early time. He now knows all the statues along the embankment. He's discovered things. He has a fantastic need to learn as well. So we looked at what was the least they could do. And the least of a break they could take was maybe 10 minutes, but to step away from their desk. Because we know even certainly your brain functioning is affected if you don't break, your eye functioning. Just getting 10 minutes away, eating something a bit more sensible, but knowing you're eating it, savouring it in good positive psychology. So you're conscious of the look and the texture of the bread, the filling, etc. So that in an hour's time you know that you did have it. Because so often you see people who've just knocked back a coffee and they don't remember they actually drank it. There's no pleasure being taken. So we looked at all of these basic things, the basic conversations at home that you could have. So effectively, the least they could get away with to ensure their own resilience. And it was delightful because they then all had their medicals and all came out much fitter than they had when they were doing all their sports in their kind of type A competitive way. They were just maintaining their health better. So it's always it sounds a bit nagging to say, looking at, in a sense, what's the least you can do to keep yourself ticking over as healthily as possible. You don't buy a great car and then put the wrong fuel in it. You service it well, and we don't accord that same respect to our own bodies and functioning. And we really need to, because it's a component. There's a psychological component of resilience, which has a lot to do with the way you think. But there's that huge physical component as well that we deserve to do well on.
Over the last 5 podcasts, we've explored what it is that really motivates us, and also taken a look at some tools and techniques that can help us to maximise our performance and energy levels at work, as well as enable us to get that really good sense of well-being and a full and balanced life. This is absolutely fundamental to organisational success, as well, of course, to individual success.
This is the meaning of life. All these decades on, it's as if I'm trying to practice the black arts that people haven't got, that they have the nerve sometimes to call my stuff soft. This is about getting the highest performance and in turn the best returns. Everybody wins, right down to the shareholder, by injecting a little humanity and a little science and professionalism into this. Because I think if we're not doing this and we're caring for our people, then people are being amateur, and that's wasteful. It's wasting an incredibly precious resource that is intrinsic to the value of our economy.
Avril, thank you for sharing your insights. So, what will you do? How will you use your strengths and talents to build that sense of a full and balanced life and deliver high performance at work and support your own well-being? This podcast brings to an end our series of 5 podcasts for National Work-Life Week 2013. In this podcast series, we've explored 5 subjects over 5 days with now 6 leading experts. We've learned how to identify what it is that's really important to us, our needs and values. We've learned how to become aware of and potentially train and direct our self-talk. We've understood how working with our bodies and our physical brains drives performance and well-being. We've also discovered the power of positive relationships, and in this podcast, how to identify and use our strengths. And all of this in order to be able to deliver sustainable, because that's what we're talking about, sustainable high performance at work, physical and psychological well-being, and a full and balanced life. Thank you for joining me in this series of podcasts for National Work-Life Week 2013. With huge thanks to our panel of experts and to our sponsor, Santander. Until next time, goodbye.